Oh, sorry.
Now
Thank
you're
you.
live.
Welcome
Hello.
back, everybody. I think we can wrap up the conversation on the recovery grants and the VITA proposal. Thank you, Cassie, for putting that memo together. It makes things a little bit more real. And we're looking at, if we went that way, which I'm not saying, we have more discussion to have, which way we're going to go. But if we went that way, I guess my thought would be it would become part of it could go in the budget. I guess it is in the governor's proposed budget. It could also be part of our economic recovery bill. It may benefit everybody to try and make it effective on passage. That may pick up a little time. And you could probably read the tea leaves in terms of how much work you might want to put up into it in advance of a governor's signature. So anyhow, I don't know that we need to talk about it anymore. It'll be on our agenda again next week, and maybe we could start coming closer to a decision. I certainly want to hear from the advocacy community on how they're feeling. There's, sounds to me there was a lot of fear and unknowns. There could still be plenty of fear, but hopefully there's a little less unknowns in terms of uh, what the program would look like. And it would be my intention, if we go down that road, to put those factors in law. As you know, I'm not a big fan of just, we've had a number of occasions where programs have been funded with millions of dollars with just the title. And I don't think that's good practice. So if anybody have any other questions for Cassie or Joan, I've asked Doug Farnham to stick around if he's still here for the next issue. But we can let these other folks go if you don't have any questions. Good. I think that was a helpful discussion. Thank you, Joan, for being patient with us.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, Cassie. Thank you. So Doug, I know in the break you said you might have some thoughts to offer on prevailing wage. We're going to move back there and have a committee discussion on that, and hopefully have a recommendation for the appropriations committee. It's going to be their call, obviously, but
Right. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, a couple of thoughts. The first being that Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage treatment for ARPA state fiscal recovery is something that Treasury has addressed in their guidance. So they've taken a progressive approach to prevailing wage standards in order to try to strike a balance between letting people accomplish these projects within the 4-year period and making sure that prevailing wage is applied to larger projects. So from my perspective, Treasury has already addressed the primary concern, and the threshold that Treasury has put in place is at 10 million. States either for a project with a size of $10 million or greater, states have to either follow Davis-Bacon and attest that they're doing so. I can certify that has happened because I had to submit that certification 3 days ago myself. So they are asking states to follow Davis-Bacon over 10 million or submit a written plan about how we are conducting our prevailing wage and fair wage standards. So I think Treasury has taken a good approach to the issue. And I do think for smaller projects, it can really magnify the administrative effort and make those smaller projects less likely to succeed if they have to go through some of that with much less chance for return on investment, right? I would also add that most of the projects, a lot of this money is going to go into projects over 10 million. And one of the reasons there is all of that broadband money, our project, the borders of a project are going to be defined as the CUDs. So most CUDs are going to be receiving at least $10 million. In this first tranche, they're not receiving quite 10 million, but subsequent funding is going to put them over that $10 million limit. And with water projects, smaller water projects would be under the threshold, but larger water projects certainly might hit that threshold. So I think
the ARPA project, I was going to ask, are the ARPA projects, that's not necessarily infrastructure money, right?
so. Actually, the final rule clarified that capital expenditures, Treasury is allowing those and has set up a process and a criteria for making capital expenditures. And that's primarily where your Davis-Bacon is going to have a chance to apply, right? Is on a physical build. And so water, sewer, broadband, those are all subject to the Davis-Bacon treatment if they're above 10 million. The capital improvements program that ACCD at ACCD, that program also qualifies as a capital expenditure. When reviewing our reports to Treasury, about 80% of our programs, and that's a rough number off the top of my head, Mr. Chair, about 80% of our programs were flagged as involving a capital expenditure in some way. So I would say that for the major activity that we're seeing, Davis-Bacon or similar wage standards will be applied.
So when you say $10 million, that's projects, I guess in a lot of these cases, it's all going to be infrastructure or ARPA dollars. I don't think the amendment we have in front of us, it just says ARPA funded. So I'm not sure it applies to infrastructure. And I don't know why it shouldn't or wouldn't, but I think as written, and Becky's with us, I'm not sure it would apply to infrastructure programs, but you say you have some guidance on that from the feds. So is the $10 million the project size or the amount of federal dollars that's involved? Because sometimes it could be mixed dollars.
Right. So it would be the amount of state fiscal recovery in that project. So it would not be the total funding stack of the project.
So that narrows its applicability significantly then.
Right. Big time.
It does, Mr. Chair, except that one thing we're seeing is that when we're entering ARPA into funding stacks of pre-existing programs, the match requirements, the funding requirements with those other federal agencies are very complicated to navigate. So I think one of the most successful approaches is not to mix the state fiscal recovery money as thoroughly into those, complex projects. I know that it's been a challenge in the housing sector.
Yes, and we didn't get Jen to testify, which
I don't necessarily think your testimony is at odds from what we heard from Senator Pearson, but he did say that the guidance, he didn't mention the 10 million. Well, maybe he did, but he said that the implication was that even in the guidance, that there was some encouragement, even though it wasn't a mandate, for states to look at paying Davis-Bacon wages for smaller projects. Do you agree with that?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I think that the guidance from Treasury encourages states to follow prevailing wage standards and to make sure they're paying a prevailing wage, but it also stops short of expecting an expectation and a documentation of that effort at the smaller project level. So I think that's the balance they tried to strike.
So I wouldn't expect you to have read the amendment. Quite frankly, I haven't read the amendment, but I am going to. We walked through it. It's pretty short, that Becky put before us. And my understanding is the administrative burden of Davis-Bacon, which people, I think, grossly overplay how hard it is to comply for a contractor to do that. They do it as a matter of course, and it's a very pretty easy form to deal with, but that's not being required in this amendment. We're just saying pay the wage, and you don't have to document it. And to the extent there's an enforcement action, well, first of all, I think people are going to follow the law to begin with. Most of these people are getting state money. They know what the requirements going to be set out in advance. We don't need them to do all the paperwork. But if someone reports them for not doing it, then there's enforcement through wage and hour and stuff like that. But so we're bypassing the paperwork portion of this just to make it simpler and easier to do, to the extent that is a problem. Is that correct, Becky?
That's correct, that there's no enforcement provisions in the amendment. So of course, if the only way that someone would be alerted to that, I think, is if there is some kind of complaint that arises from someone not following the requirement. And I think the penalty for that would be they'd be in violation of their contract.
Right.
So the possibility of getting the grant funds taken away. And then I think it sounds like Department of Labor also has just sort of general statutory authority to oversee.
And I wasn't really talking about enforcement. I was just talking about Mr. Farnham's comment that, that it may be a lot of paperwork in terms of filing weekly reports that's generally required in Davis-Bacon, and we don't have that in this bill, correct?
Right. There's nothing in the bill that, again, would require anyone submitting any paperwork to an agency. So I think the only way it would create an administrative burden is if a complaint arises and then someone has to deal with how to sort of investigate that.
And most of these projects are fairly significant in size, with reputable builders that know Davis-Bacon, and people who work for them know that they're entitled to Davis-Bacon wages. And if, all of a sudden they started getting paid $20 an hour versus $30 an hour, they would know about it and they might complain. So anyhow, I wouldn't have expected, Doug, for you to realize that from this amendment, but yes, Senator Brock.
Just a question, Doug, good to see you again. What will the effect of this amendment have on the cost of projects?
So, Senator, I think depending upon the type of project in the industry, I wouldn't really be able to predict. I don't see how the amendment could make any projects less expensive. It could theoretically make them more expensive, but my understanding is that most of our wages on these types of projects already would meet the requirements. I think the one thing I would add is that I don't know how it would exactly change the numbers. I think that's very difficult to predict at this point in time. On the major projects, it shouldn't change anything because Treasury is already requiring us to do that for the largest of the projects. The one wrinkle I would say on the administrative side, Mr. Chair, is that Treasury requires us to follow any state laws. And so one thing we would have to do is document what we're doing at the program level to comply with this law. So even if documents aren't needed to be submitted by the contractors, the program would need to document how we are making sure this is in place. So I think it would place an additional requirement on the program side, on the internal administrative side, and could slow down smaller projects.
Well, as I understood what you indicated in terms of Treasury guidance, it says that on a project that is valued at $10 million or more, even though the federal law does not require payment of Davis-Bacon wages, you are asked to document that you have paid such wages. Is that correct?
Senator, the requirement is to either assert that you are following Davis-Bacon or submit a plan that shows how you are imposing or following a similar standard to Davis-Bacon.
Okay. Now, on projects, this particular amendment begins at $200,000, and there's of course, a large gap between $200,000 and $10 million. And absent this bill, there's nothing that you would be required to do by the federal government in this regard. Is that right?
For those small projects, correct. That is correct, Senator.
Do you have any sense for just how many projects we might be talking about overall, or what dollar value we might be talking about?
I think it could be misleading for me to speculate there, Senator. I know of at least 100 approved projects right now, but I haven't reviewed that list to see which fall below the threshold and which are above the threshold. So I would say with ARPA money, we're going to be looking at several hundred projects as a general scope at a minimum. But for example, the capital improvements project or program, that could have 40 projects right now. If it received additional funding, it could have a similar number each year. So the general ballpark is that this would likely impact at least several hundred projects.
Do you know if there is in fact a gap, particularly in that $200,000 plus category? Are there a significant number of projects where the wage paid is different than the so-called prevailing wage that we may be talking about here?
I'm not qualified to answer that question, Senator.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I just want to clarify one point here. You're talking about an administrative burden, and it may fall right in your lap because you're so close to this stuff, of attesting that if we pass this law, that the contractors are following state law as far as our mini Davis-Bacon thing. The bill, I think, says or is anticipated that there will be a requirement in the bid contracting process, the letting, notifying people clearly that they have to pay Davis-Bacon wages. Is it really all that complicated to attest? I mean, you're not going to go forward and say what I just talked about, where we said there's nothing in this bill that requires weekly statements like Davis-Bacon requires to say this guy got paid this guy got paid that. You're not going to just impose that on all these contracts, are you? I mean, I just want to get a real sense of what kind of investigation you're going to have to do to certify that you believe that your contractees are following the law.
So, Mr. Chair, I think the thing that concerns me is I would have to look at it and probably talk to Guidehouse to see what they would advise as a level of monitoring and compliance. What level of proof is sufficient for Treasury under these circumstances to show that we've complied with our own law? I think the primary reason I'm pointing it out is that we only have just over 4 years to spend this money and to make sure it gets spent properly. And it's a timing problem. We're already concerned that with our ability to make sure this money all gets spent the right way. So complicating an already significantly challenging task is my primary concern, Mr. Chair. Recognizing that the legislature is looking into ways to mitigate and to make it less burdensome. I just think we're already challenged at this point in time.
Well, I also think that as you said early on, that the intent of, or the hope of Congress in the guidelines was that states might look at making sure people got prevailing wage. And I think it would be somewhat inconsistent with that if the U.S. Department of Labor or whoever has to approve what you need to send to them would come down with a heavy administrative burden on you. But fair enough. I think it's been open and honest conversation here. I want to just move to a show of hands on this, unless people have more
to say, Senator Brock, I want to say I respect your concern. We have different positions on, maybe we have different positions. I don't want to put words in your mouth because you said you might come to support this with more information. So I'm saying it, but I do think we have a tension here of missing the boat on a lot of projects in terms of sacrificing the good for the perfection in the legislative process. And sometimes we need to be a little bit more nimble. I think this is one of those cases, but I do respect that this is not the normal course of review for something like this. And but I think it's necessary in this case. So any further discussion on this? I don't see Senator Ballant here, but I do
I've
think,
just let her know that we're about to vote. She left with a phone call that as
this is a little unusual. Senator Kitchell asked for our recommendation, so we don't have a bill, we don't have an amendment in our possession. Hasn't been offered formally yet, but we're just gonna, I would just say whatever the vote is, I'd say, we took an hour and 15 minutes worth of testimony and discussion, and this is what we recommend. And there's no guarantee that they're gonna support it themselves. But if we support it, I guess one of us would get up on the floor, say what we did, and say we support the amendment or don't. So,
great.
Senator Brock, I'm looking to you if you have any more comments, or should we just proceed to a hand vote?
No, I don't think we need to belabor. I obviously am concerned that we're voting on an amendment that we don't have, that we've seen a draft of for all of 10 minutes, that could have millions of dollars of impact in the spend of public money, but we don't know because we don't even have a clue as to what it would cost. I think it's irresponsible to vote on this as quickly as this without more thorough inquiry. That's just where I'm coming from here. I am not comfortable with this at all.
Okay, I hear you. Any further discussion?
I mean, I
Okay,
do think it's been longer than 10 minutes. That's all.
Yeah, it's been an hour.
So,
We have a
and
bill
we
for
did it-
hands to be able to read for 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
okay, so again, this is just a show of hands of a message that I'm going to send to. I mean, I don't even think. I mean, I guess I could report if I'm going to report it. If the vote is 4-1, as I expect it will be, not to prejudge things, but if,
Mr. Chair,
yes.
of course, we're doing, second reading today. So, we don't need to deal with this until third reading.
we can, actually, I was going to suggest that we could take a straw vote on this.
Yep.
I don't know that Jane really wants, she wants a feeling of what the committee is. Then when the amendment gets presented to the floor, we're obviously all free to vote however we
Yep.
want. It's not a committee amendment.
Right.
I guess, Senator Brock, one thing that could happen, we're going to meet again before we go on the floor for third reading. If you wanted to come in tomorrow with any further tweaks other than just voting this down, we would find the time to listen to that. But at this point, I just like to honor what Senator Kitchell has asked of me and just give her a read of what the committee took testimony and tell her what we're thinking.
I mean, the one thing that I am considering is a further amendment to actually do some calculation on the back end to figure out what this actually cost. In other words, what we did, what was the actual additional cost that might have been incurred as a result. And I need to think about that and study it a bit more by saying that I'm in fact going to offer that. I mean, this has the potential of being the most expensive amendment per minute of discussion that we passed in years.
Well, we also have data that you could get, Randy, from in terms of from our 2009. I feel comfortable. We did this before with with ERA money. I feel very comfortable doing it. And Matt's testimony and Lori's testimony gives me comfort that it's A, not an administrative burden, and B, contracting companies are familiar and used to dealing with this standard, and that in fact at this point in time, and probably for the duration of ARPA money, this is not a huge financial, this would not be a huge financial burden or addition. So I that's what's giving me comfort in voting to support this amendment. Both
Well,
the
the answer
experience with
I
ERA.
don't know, and none of the witnesses we've talked about knows what this is going to cost. And as I go back through my ages of memory to 2009, I believe I voted against it then.
Senator Ballant.
Just simply put, there's a lot of precedent for this. There's a lot of precedent over many years. So I'm very comfortable with this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, just real quickly, those in favor of me communicating with the Chair of Appropriations that we support what's in front of us at this point, raise your hand, please. Okay, those opposed? Thank you. After that, we're right at noon. Wow. What time management skills I'm developing here.
So,
Uh,
Thanks.
Mr.
I got to go. I have a hard
Yeah.
stop it.
Yeah,
So thank you
Mr.
much.
Chair, we
Thank you,
need to
Randy.
chat with Scott, agenda planning, I think.
Oh, yes. Wow. Yes, we do.
And we have a 12:15 Budget Adjustment Act explanation on the floor of the Senate at 12:15 with
Okay.
uh,
Let's
Jane
go
Kitchell.
off live and let's